Thank you very much, Ray. Is my voice going through the speakers? Great, okay. Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's an honour to be asked to address the Grasslands Congress, especially about social issues. So, wrong place. Right. This satellite image is indeed about changing worlds. This is the Simpson Desert, or Mungathiri, as the Aboriginal people call it. And at the moment, it's a very different landscape to what it normally is. It has strips of green grass that you can see here, paralleling the sandy dunes that you can also see there. The parallel sand dune systems are between 10 and 50 metres high, and they stretch for several hundred kilometres. This is one of the largest parallel dune systems in the world. But this slide also indicates social change. The satellite image was sent out a few days ago by a friend of mine who was tracking her husband, a ranger, who's flying over the Simpson Desert with an Aboriginal elder, a Mungathiri man. They're planning where to start fires in the desert while it's damp. So it's a modern take on cultural burning using traditional knowledge. And just so that you can see where the Simpson Desert is, that's where it is in Australia. It's quite a large area, 180,000 square kilometres. So I think using modern technology makes sense. And this demonstrates an evolving culture, which is true for so many Indigenous cultures. This presentation today will outline what changes we see in the world today, particularly social changes, and then I'll briefly explain what is social change, what are some of the key social changes from around the world, and we've done a quick survey about that, and then I'll present a few case studies from around the world about social changes which are influencing rural communities. Briefly, I'll look at how do we manage social change, and I'll finish by posing a few questions about the role of the International Rangelands Congresses, which other people have already done. So, the world has certainly seen some disruptive changes over the last few years, including droughts and fires. As a quick side, pastoralist to me is an all-encompassing term. I know everybody doesn't necessarily see themselves as a pastoralist, and it depends what part of the world you come from. So, but to me, pastoralist is anybody who has pastures and livestock, no matter what people may think of themselves in the region. And we've just finished doing a glossary of social terms in the rangelands, and there's many, many terms that describe what pastoralists are, from gillaroos to gauchos to ranchers and many more. So, back to my slideshow. All of us have been affected to some extent by change and sometimes fire in rural areas. The NASA fire maps show fires burning around the world on a monthly basis over the last 3 or 4 years. This particular photo was taken just south of Sydney at a little settlement called Lake Conjoul, and it was taken on New Year's Eve, and it symbolises the devastation of the fires, the widespread fires that took place in Australia in 2019-2020. Day turned to night in this little community, and the town evacuated themselves onto the beach. The fire got so close and was so fierce that mothers had their kids hanging in the water underneath the jetty to stay safe. Eventually, the whole community was actually evacuated by the armed forces. So it was a very traumatic thing, and it really hit the media in Australia. So across that summer in Australia, we lost 42 million hectares that burnt. It killed something like 3 billion animals, and koalas tipped closer to extinction during those fires. A recent scientific paper suggests that those fires were so catastrophic that the cloud that overhung the Pacific Ocean has reduced the temperature in the sea level there and may have actually contributed to the triple dip of La Nina that we saw in Australia, where we had good seasons for 3 years, but of course across the ocean in Africa they had poor seasons because their weather systems are linked to ours. So floods is the other thing. This photo here is of cattle standing in water. So the brown that you can see there, that's not sand or dirt, that's water that those cattle are standing in. Almost the whole of Lake Nash was underwater during the 2021 floods. The people were very organised, so everybody got out, but nothing could be done to save the livestock. Many of them had to keep swimming, even though they were a bit cold, but they were in good condition, so quite a lot survived. It's not the biggest flood that we've had in Australia. The biggest was probably 2 years before, in February 2019, where we lost over 650,000 cattle. But many were weak before they went into that flood, and many died of pneumonia because of the cold that came afterwards. So there was over $800 million of infrastructure losses related to that flood. But there were stories of resilience and community working together that were very inspiring coming out of those floods. At one stage during the big flood, there was 20 helicopters, all manned by volunteer helicopter pilots at the Hughenden Airport, and they were running medicines and food drops out to families who were isolated, and they were also dropping hay to starving cattle, and some of them were actually shooting the cattle that couldn't be saved because they were stuck in the mud. So it's not just in Australia that we've had floods, it's been cyclones in Vanuatu, tornadoes here in the US, floods in Europe. Climate change has certainly exacerbated some of these effects. So droughts. Here we have an African Maasai woman collecting water in Kenya. And when she fills that drum, she'll walk that water back to her village, as do many of the African women and children walk for several miles across the savannah to get water in Kenya. School children that I visited when I was in Kenya walked 4 kilometres every day at lunchtime just to get a drink of water because there was no tank at the school. So water is a precious commodity, especially during droughts. And we can't dismiss the disruptions that the world has experienced due to the COVID-19 pandemic and to the wars and the conflicts such as the Ukrainian-Russian war. These changes have highlighted some of the key issues that need to be addressed in rangelands and in grasslands. One very positive outcome from all of these challenges has been that the role of agriculture is now considered to be a little bit more important, and we've certainly noticed that in Australia. And I hope we don't forget that. That's something that I think we can capitalise on. So food has been identified as a major issue facing society, both food security and equitable food systems. These have been identified by people like the Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, who put lots of money into these issues. So conflict is still the biggest driver of hunger in the world. And the scale of the current global hunger and malnutrition crisis is enormous, as other speakers in this conference have already alluded to. And there's been a significant increase in the last few years with the number of people that are now facing food insecurity. There's been an increase of over 100 million people that are hungry now than pre-COVID times. And in this year, in 2023, it's expected that more than 500 million people worldwide are predicted to be fighting to survive in famines. Climate crisis is one of the leading causes, which also has caused a steep rise in global hunger. And the costs of many of these things that help agriculture have risen significantly, compounding the problems. So the cost of inputs for producing crops and crops to feed animals have certainly increased for many people around the world. And in Australia and in other parts of the world, it's certainly making some farmers rethink their management practices. So it's causing a social change. Low input farming approaches are being promoted in many regions, and various types of regenerative farming are gaining traction in Australia. But I must say this is a quiet revolution. It's not one that's widely discussed. So FAO has looked at the crisis that's happening and the costs of food that's increasing, and they're postulating that perhaps we're headed for an affordability crisis rather than the availability crisis that we currently have. I think we all realise that until now we've had enough food to feed the world. The problem has been that the food's not been in the right places with the right people, and they couldn't afford to buy it. The problem was how to distribute food equitably around the world. But if an availability crisis does develop, as FAO says it might, that will certainly force major social change in many countries, as countries will need to become much more self-sufficient. Another threat that's been mentioned at this Congress is the vegan movement and the fake meat production. These are both a threat to beef cattle production as well as a threat to our health, as a few keynote speakers have alluded to. Gender equity is another key issue that's highlighted by FAO, the Gates Foundation and other organisations. So in many countries, food and gender are closely linked, with gender inequity often exacerbating food insecurity. This woman in Kenya here highlights the key role that women play in growing crops on small farms. In Kenya, it's sometimes 1 or 2 acres. Women still do most of the cooking in many countries, as illustrated by the woman here in Iran cooking naan, bread, on an open fire. The women, as we know, often tend to do the unpaid work in the families. But worldwide, almost half the farmers or pastoralists are women, although this does vary between countries. And yet, in some countries, women cannot own land. So there's some figures on this slide. And one example that I'll give is it's not just ownership of land that's an issue. In the Middle East, for example, most countries there have enshrined property ownership rights for women. However, in many of these Arab nations, North Africa, West Asia, in 2021, almost 40% of the married women in those countries felt insecure about their land and their property rights. So it's important to realise that it's just not about the legal right to own land, but it's also about legal rights to inherit land, because that's often how people get their land. They don't necessarily buy it. And then, of course, we have society's norms and whether or not society will accept that inheritance is allowed for women, or if it's the men that should be inheriting land. And I certainly know from personal experience that society norms in Australia have certainly disadvantaged women. There's been discrimination in inheritance norms, which have limited people's ability to own land. So, given that women are so significant in part livestock industries and in farming, innovation is certainly needed to address gender inequality in agriculture. An FAO report that was presented at COP has highlighted the need for more innovative machinery on small farms, and this will certainly help women. But I'd also like to postulate that we need to look at small implements as well, because as a retired pastoralist myself, my father used to often look at my hands and say I couldn't manage to do the tasks because the tools I was trying to use, even if it was a pair of fencing pliers, were designed by men, for use by men, and not for me and my little hands. So I think there's a lot that can be done to actually help support women who are farmers and produce a lot of the food that the world has. If we want to build more resilient communities to overcome changes that are happening, we must involve the women. We can't leave out 50% of the population, because strength comes from diversity in communication, and diversity in management styles, whether it's managing the community organisations or managing the farm itself. So how do you understand social change? What are the social changes evident in the grasslands? Changes vary in different regions, even between states, Kentucky and Ohio, I've heard people say, explain to me differences here. Changes are different for different sectors in society. So many of us here in this room are involved in managing social change in some form, in grasslands or in rangelands. As grassland scientists, as agricultural extension officers, as social scientists, we often work to help other people manage change, and we often try to encourage change in certain ways. Those dumb farmers never know what to do, I hope that's an attitude that's starting to disappear in extension services around the world. So, and some of my farmer people that I have just met are smiling over there. We may work with governments, we may work with policymakers, with journalists, with industry groups, or with farmers or pastoralists. there's a variety of people that we work with. So what sort of social change are you personally going through at the moment? Maybe there's a new baby or a new grandchild expected in your family. Maybe you're thinking about retirement. Maybe there's a significant change occurring in your community. In my community where I live in Australia, fracking of highly productive grasslands and croplands near to Toowoomba is a major issue. And the social impact of that is that it's divided the local community. Neighbours aren't talking, families aren't talking to each other. So it's had a major and very sad impact. Of the two major issues I mentioned before, food security and gender equality may be an issue for some of you in your workplace. I doubt food security is a major issue for most of us in this room. But the scale that we operate at certainly varies. Some of us work at the local scale with farmers, promoting adoption of more drought-resistant varieties of crop. We might be fostering carbon credits or not. At international scales, we may be involved in the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists, and I hope all of you are, or are certainly thinking about getting involved now. So how social change is understood, and particularly how it's experienced, depends on your personal experience. Society has divisions between cultures, between incomes, between beliefs and values. Many of the people living and working in grasslands around the world are the poorest of the poor in society. So not only in income, but in education and access to various services, even telecommunication systems. These can all influence how change is experienced. Change may be imposed from the outside, or it may be something that we choose to do or choose to influence. As a landholder, individuals' perspectives of the world certainly influence how we experience change. Some believe that they can only influence what happens on their property, so up to the farm gate. And other producers have a broader view and believe that they can influence beyond that. And one example that I'll draw on is the Obi beef producers out in the rangelands, in the desert lands in Australia. They believe that they can influence beyond the farm gate, and they've set up trading routes for organic beef into Japan and other countries around the world. So the Obi beef producers are about 40 families, and they manage an area about the size of Nebraska, 20 million acres. So between them, they manage to have meat going off their properties at various times during the year, and they have their own trading partners that they deal directly with. So this is a great example of people breaking down society's divisions of culture, gender, and even values. So social change has a myriad of definitions, and I have one up there on the screen. There's extensive theory and various ways of explaining what change is. There's many different types of social change, and there's a couple alluded to there. Change can be slow, it can be the system maintaining its stability, or a conflict may initiate change. I think that we need all these different types of change in different situations. But the key point, I think, is that change can be good. Change doesn't have to be bad, as many people assume. Sometimes we need transformational change in situations where change is happening very rapidly or there's a massive change coming upon us. And I think transformational change is something that we really do need in today's society. So we've been through some definitions of social change. So definitions of grasslands and rangelands. I'll just briefly put these up. Thank you, Vivian, for these definitions. They've come straight from the glossary that you and others have prepared. I think what's important to me is that we might have, 40% of the world is rangelands and 40% is grasslands, but really 60% of both of those overlap. So we have more in common than we have difference, especially when it comes to social issues. But that's not to diminish the complexities and the nuances, the differences between regions, even if they're close to each other. In a recent social survey that we did, one person suggested that rangelands was more about land use. It's where livestock range. And grasslands is more about an ecological term, where grasslands grow. And I think these are the sort of simple definitions that we may need to talk about if we're going to go for our elevator pitch. I know that it hides much of the complexity, but to people who aren't familiar with these terms, then we need simple ways of explaining it so that we can get on to the important stuff, which isn't the definition, but is about what's happening in the rangelands and how important they are. So a couple of us did a small survey for this Congress, and you probably can't see the graphs there in detail, but I can tell you that there was a 40% return rate, which is very good, but that only means that we got 28 people responding. So we definitely like to expand this and greater representation. Nonetheless, we've got some interesting data, both quantitative and qualitative data. The first question that we asked, which is the graph on your left there, if we can combine the categories, the most prevalent respondents were from Asia, the second most respondents were from Africa, and the third from Europe. Often respondents work in several countries, and we do have the specific countries where everybody worked, and I think that's important to be able to do some correlations later. The second graph shows that most of the respondents of this survey are researchers. 24 out of the 28 had some research role, but of course, again, many people specified more than one role, which we had asked them to do. So the results, this is what's more interesting, I think. Oh, no. This is the differences. This is the differences between rangelands and grasslands. 3/4 of the people that we talked to actually thought that there was very little difference, especially when it came to social issues, between rangelands and grasslands. And I think that reiterates my points before, that there is very little difference in many of the social issues that we're dealing with. And a couple of the differences that people saw were around ownership and regulation of grasslands and rangelands. But others were saying that more differences actually occur not between grasslands and rangelands, but between pastoralists and government, or between pastoralists in different regions around the world. That's where you get the differences in social issues and environmental issues, I'd suggest. Now to the more interesting data, I think, from the survey. As I've just said, the data is mainly from 3 continents, but the key issue for many people, 20-odd people said that this was a key issue, is if you look at loss of access to land, which is bar number 1 and bar number 4 here, loss of access to land is a key issue. Access to land due to state and government policies and development projects, 55% of people said that, and they were saying things like forest grazing is almost banned in our area. We don't have secure tenure. So the other issues, which are all listed here, changing aspirations of youth came up as quite a high issue for many people. About 14 people saw this. Youth see no hope in traditional livelihoods, one person said. Another said there was depopulation of rural areas. Youth, and especially young women, were leaving pastoral areas. And another said that youth are not exposed to pastoralism, so they're not taught what to do on the land. They're not taught how to understand the land. So discussions after the results came in with colleagues and European research indicates that this might not be true, even though it is certainly the perception of many people, both those living in rural communities and researchers working there. My view in Australia actually aligns with the research that's been done in Europe, and that is that young people certainly do leave. When they get to the end of their schooling, they might have been away at schooling, but they don't come home then. They go off and have a career in some field somewhere in the world. But they do often come back. That's what the key is. They might not come back until they're getting married, until they've got children, but they often do come back and then take over the management of the land from their fathers and mothers. So lack of access to services was said by 11 people in Asia to be an issue, but I think that's an issue with any rural and remote area around the world. where they're often devoid of basic services like education, and in Kenya, water resources. The loss of traditional knowledge was seen as important by a few people, and this reinforces the general perception that grasslands, and especially rangelands, are just wastelands. They're areas that need to be developed because they're not useful in a natural state. Certainly the last dot point on the graph here was about governance and institutional arrangement, and this is where I think we're definitely likely to need institutional change and transformational change of some of these institutional arrangements, and I'll come back to that later. Interestingly, gender was not listed as a key issue. It was only mentioned by 4 people. And this may be because at the moment other issues are more important. So food insecurity, conflicts in countries and climate change are exacerbating many of these issues such as access to land. So gender isn't ranking as particularly important, although we know that perhaps it is. I've yet to do an analysis of who was answering who the respondents were and the proportion of men and women, because we didn't ask them that. So let's go to a few case studies to explore in a little bit more detail what social change means for rural communities. So, okay, we're going to Tibet. This is the Kokonor region, which is one of the important pastoral regions in Tibet, and it's around Lake Kokonor. The Sage pastoralists here graze about 65,000 head of livestock, and sheep account for most of those. In the last couple of decades, Saga has attracted massive investment from the state, from the government, because of the richness in its ethnic culture, in its biodiversity, and its natural resources generally. This has meant a boost in land prices, and for pastoralists, better connections to a bigger market, which is a good thing. The promotion of tourism around Lake Kokonor has been very strong by the province as well as by the Chinese government. But the new forms of land control that have occurred are not necessarily beneficial to many pastoralists. There's been land grabbing by external investors and land appropriation by government for conservation projects, and land being taken away by government for tourism operations as well. So this quote here about the lake expansion was from one of the leading meteorological experts at the province level. Not surprisingly, a researcher in the area told me that the government expert highlights the advantages for the expansion of conservation, the disadvantages for tourism infrastructure around the lake, but they completely ignored the negative aspects such as rangeland loss and pasture loss, which is what the pastoralists are feeling around that area. And yet a third of the Saga families have completely lost their winter pastures due to the expansion of the lake. And just briefly, I'll say that the lake expansion seems to be partly due to increased rain in that area, but also it's the result of many of the conservation projects which have happened, whether it's the clearing of the river, replanting of areas, the decommissioning of land where livestock have been taken off or planting of forests have occurred. So Uncle Ducker in the photo there on the top right, his family's life depends on livestock herding, but with the number of tourists increasing over these years, the families believe that it's worthwhile to invest some time and effort in summer tourism, so he takes people out horse riding in the pastures. Unfortunately, the pastoralists have confronted some difficulties when they engage in tourism as a result of government regulations that they haven't always observed. But the key thing that comes out of this is that the pastoralists have not been listened to. As one pastoralist stated, we simply remain silent. The larger the lake, the merrier. We're treating it as a blessing from a sacred lake. Even if we do write letters to government, they'll not give us much consideration because it's always been like that. So the pastoralists do think of it as a sacred lake, and it saved their lives in the past because there's been a famine in the not-so-distant past where the fish from the lake kept everybody alive. But here we can see that the exclusion of local herders from the policy process, where they're not allowed to be involved and to have their voice heard means that the herders have lost their pastures and as a result are likely to lose their livelihoods. Okay, I'm going to go back because we've missed India. India. So the case study here comes from a colleague of mine, Rashmi, who's worked in this area and did her PhD in the area, where gender is a particularly important issue for the grasslands here. When people talk about pastoralists in India, in this part of India, the image that comes into people's heads is of a male pastoralist with a herd of animal and a stick. This guy hasn't got a stick. But the day-to-day management of pastoralists and livestock, it's the women who do most of the work. They contribute equally and sometimes much more than the men. Yet their voice is mostly absent from any forms of community participation. It's partly because of historical marginalisation of women, and women are not seen in any key positions in pastoral institutions. And yet the women are involved in preparing the animal feed. They take care of the young animals or sub-adult animals. They milk the animals. And they also contribute to the household's economy by making livestock-derived products such as cheese and locally known as chirpy, and also ghee, which is similar to butter. So in this district, which is the Sikkim district, which is situated in India near the eastern Himalayas, people have been evicted from the park where they used to graze their animals when a grazing ban was implemented. And it's interesting that the conservation and development policies have meant very different outcomes and different views from both the male and the female members of the community. So for the men, they attributed the loss to a loss of income, a loss of animal wealth, and a loss of pastoralist culture, a way of living. For the women, the loss of grazing rights has meant that they were nostalgic about the freedom that they had to go out with the livestock, the respect that they associated with a nomadic way of life. They also missed the sense of community that the women shared amongst each other in extreme climatic conditions, and with the help that they were ready to give each other, especially at time of childbirth. Those social connections for the women had really broken down. And the women also associated a more sedentary lifestyle with an increase in the chances of disease like diabetes, and their food habits had changed dramatically. So the questions of gender, class and community status need to be central when we're making conservation decisions in the high altitude regions of South Asia. It's a home for great diversity for pastoralists as well as wildlife. And I need to mention that within all these case studies, I'm just picking one issue, but there's a complexity of interrelated issues, and the specific contexts are very important to consider. In some areas, the traditional governance arrangements will be quite different in different locations. We'll skip Tibet and go to the Arctic. So, reindeer herding is characterised by semi-domesticated reindeer and extensive and cyclical use of seasonal pastures. In the South Sami area, it's to a large degree practised on private owned outfields. Thanks, Ray. So reindeer herding is at the heart of Sami culture, and it's not well known that Sami live quite a long way down on the coast, and that reindeer herders still here do animal migration. The media and the public perception is that reindeer can be a cause of environmental degradation. Climate change has certainly meant that the slopes are more slippery because there's more ice and less snow. So there's stories about reindeer herders falling over the edge or falling and getting legs broken. And the question that the media asks is, what's wrong with these people? So there's a tendency to blame the victims rather than asking what's wrong with their environments and why are things changing. So in Norway, there's green-labelled extractive industries which are also a threat to their territories. So this is the area that I'm talking about, which is where the southern Sami are. This is their territory where that big dot is. So the green infrastructure. Norway was the first country to recognise tribal peoples back in the 1990s, but when the Sami complain about wind turbines, they're not listened to again. So it negatively affects the reindeer pasture lands and negatively interrupts their migration routes. So under Norwegian law, Sami livelihoods should be protected, but a court case in the 2020s awarded the Sami $9 million US. And this was certainly vindication that wind turbines are impacting on Sami livelihoods. But it wasn't really a recognition of the value of Sami culture, because that was to pay for fodder feed for the herds in the winter, because they couldn't go out in their pastures. So it meant the migrations up into the mountains in the winter, as one of these photos is showing, just doesn't happen anymore in this area. So cultural practices have been abandoned. So, and as you can see here, the Sami aren't against wind turbines, but they question if they're the ones that need to suffer. They want to be involved in consultation. They say consultation was done, but they were given two choices. And basically they said, we got to choose between whether we were going to be shot in the left leg or whether we were going to be shot in the right leg. There was no question about whether or not they wanted wind turbines or not. So this is a major state-Sami relationship breach at the moment, which is one of the largest breaches of trust in history in this country. Now we'll go to Australia, where there's a distinct loss of knowledge. So one of the things that I've noticed in working with Aboriginal people in Western Queensland, where I've been doing a small project, was how much traditional knowledge has been lost. The photo here of the three men is three men from different Aboriginal nations. There's a Mardigan guy, a Keynote guy, and a Gamilaroi guy. Two of these guys are well connected to their culture, and one has only just discovered that he has Aboriginal heritage, which is a result of colonial practices, colonial policies. He's part of the stolen generation, where someone earlier in his family has been taken away from their parents, and so the link to country was broken completely. So because white settlement is very sparse across the inland, the extent to which knowledge is lost is very different in very different parts of Australia. We need to remember that Australia is actually about 260 different nations, so each of them have their own culture, their own language. There's some 500 different Aboriginal languages in Australia. So it's certainly not a homogenous group, as many Australians would think. So, and here's a quote from one guy who felt comfortable enough to say to me that he doesn't know any traditional stories. He doesn't have any of that traditional knowledge, and he explains the reason here why. So, the grinding grooves there, I'll just very briefly say, there's hundreds of these along an ephemeral lake that I was shown when I was out there. And the Aboriginal people there, the guide didn't really know, and the guy who lives there doesn't really know what they were for. They were probably for grinding grain to make bread or muthi, but it could have been to grind leaves to make medicine. There are storage holes in the rocks nearby that I was shown, which weren't in the watercourses, so they would have been able to keep whatever was in there dry whenever it rained. So there's certainly reports in early explorers' diaries about large expanses of grain out in these countries, which would have been used for bread. And there's also reports of very large ovens and settled communities around the ovens, little villages that have been set up. So there's a significant loss of culture, very largely because of colonisation policies. But there's also some knowledge left. And one story that I really liked was about the emu. So at a certain time of the year, in around April or May, an emu appears in the sky, not far from the Southern Cross. And the photo here, you can see the star constellation and then how it looks like an emu. And this denotes to Aboriginal people that it's time to go out and collect emu eggs that they can use for food. So there's many of these stories are still around, but this one about the emu is generic across Australia and is well recorded. So there's not necessarily a lot of stories from that particular area. They're still available. And one thing that I found, they certainly know a little bit about spear and making implements, coulamons and so forth. And they also we've gone too far. They also know a little about their medicine plants, like the gumby is one that's quite commonly used, and it's used for diabetes. It's ground into a paste, or sometimes it's made into a cream. So there's smoking ceremonies that are held still, and they're about cleansing people, welcoming people to country. The First Nations people are very spiritual, deeply connected to their land and their waterways and the skies, as are many Indigenous communities around the country. And this is one of the ephemeral lakes there on the right. Here we have cultural burning, which is one of the more recognised cultural practices that are still happening in Australia. And just in the last few weeks, one of our fire practitioners, Victor Stephenson from Fire Sticks Alliance, has been over in Canada and the US talking about cultural burning to Indigenous communities here. So a quote from a guy in North Queensland, Barry Hunter, who said, even people that have been dispersed and dispossessed of their land, that cultural knowledge is seemingly lost to many of these people, but they will still have some knowledge within them. They still have a deep spiritual connection to the land and a feeling that the land is calling them home. And that was certainly expressed in many of the interviews that I did. So we'll skip over this one. So it's policy changes are needed, and there's some of the quick suggestions that came out of the survey that we did. So one thing that I would like to mention is that how do we manage social change? What do we do to help people manage social change? And this was an acronym that I came up with after doing a resilience and vulnerability project in Western Queensland. And it's about DUST, which is very appropriate for the community that I was working in at the time. And D is for deciding that you want to get involved and work with change with that community. The U is about understanding and deeply understanding what that community is about, who they are, what their traditional organisations are. And I'm talking about, I was working in a white community when I came up with this and was looking at resilience, a white pastoral community and a white town community associated in rural and remote Queensland. The S is about supporting existing arrangements, existing traditional organisations that were operating well and things that were going really well within the community. And then the T is looking at transformational change that might be needed in that community. So I've seen other colleagues working in resilience and vulnerability come up with other acronyms for the Asia Pacific region that don't involve DUST. So just quickly to the Grasslands congresses. As a Grasslands committee, it's great to see that change is more people-related within the congresses now. The very first Congress had one economics paper, which is surprising given that it was one back then, surprising that there was even one. Over the years, we have seen an increase in papers, and at this Congress there's approximately 20 papers directed focused on social issues particularly. And I think we need to look at where organisations like the Rangelands Committee and the Grasslands Committee goes in the future. And we've had questions posed by Peter about whether or not there should be a ruminant revolution. Sorry, Peter. And certainly, I think we need to look at how pastoralist voices can be more heard, how we can hear from the people who are managing the land directly, and how traditional voices might be better incorporated. Often specific issue events are more likely to attract people, but I think it's really important that we have overarching events like this that bring a systems view and a more holistic view to land management. When I was looking through your conference proceedings, I found this quote: "Grass is the root of social change," and that was back in the 1950s. So it was acknowledged then as important, and I think we need to look to the future about how to work together, how to use different kinds of knowledge to respect each other, and we need to welcome change, take heed of what the pandemic has shown us. We don't want the system going back to normal. We need to move forward. And we need to get on board with that change and work with people to make the most out of it. Thank you.
Yes, one over there just a second. Then an excellent overview, and thank you for contributing and expanding our thoughts and our understanding, but inspiring us with social issues. Yes.
Thanks for that, Dana. It's an excellent look into how we should be thinking about how social issues influence the way we should think about this. I was really interested in your slide on the Indian example at the Sikkim communities. And the thing that intrigued me in that particular response when you put it up was the significant change in tone of word between the responses of males and females. That was kind of interesting. The males immediately just said relatively simple things like loss of income. And yet the women were very represented, potentially by you, with a lot more descriptive outcomes in terms of what they were thinking. And it's interesting that they also reflect the roles or the traditional roles of men and women in society in terms of being providers versus nurturers. Any thoughts on the way those words were put together?
I agree with you that it is very reflective of the roles that men and women have in that society and the things that they're responsible for, whether it be the family or making money. And the women then thought more broadly about what the impacts were for the whole of the family, whereas the men were more focused on the income. The young woman who did that research, that was part of her PhD research. She's an Indian woman herself. The women may have felt more comfortable talking to her, and therefore she may have got a lot more information from them. But she was well known in the community and well respected. So I don't think that had too much of an influence. But I certainly am aware of that when I'm doing research, that often the women feel more comfortable talking to me, and I'll get a lot from the women respondents.
Let's thank Dana again.